Hello, I'm Joan Mansson of Mansson Fine Art. I'm a wildlife artist, but today I'm going to be demonstrating a landscape. This is from a photograph I took at Baker's Beach at San Francisco, California. And I'm trying to practice doing landscapes so that I can incorporate them with portraits that I do of animals and wildlife. I hope you enjoy it. It's just under an hour. Everything that you'll need is listed on the last slide of this video, or you can take a look at the description beneath this video. Thank you very much for joining me, and I do hope you have a good time. I'm going to be working with sponge applicators. The PanPastels that I'm using are to the left. All the colors are listed on the last screen of the video. I have two sponge applicators. Let me get my picture straightened out here for you. There we go. I think you can see that much better. Now, I don't draw the image, although I love to draw. I'm working on pastel matte paper, which is a slightly sanded paper with a plastic backing. I find to be the best one that I have used, although the Canson pastel papers and the Strathmores are really very good as well. This is our photograph, and the one I'll be using for reference. I have glycine paper. It actually comes with the pastel mat, so I just tear out a sheet and they last forever. I tend to lose them before I use them up. I'm going to be attacked by my reference photo. I'm going to be applying the colorless blender to the entire surface. The pastel matte color is wheat. And when you're working on a toned paper, the work you do reflects that color. So it's always good to choose something that's somehow going to work with the piece that you're doing. This is the oblong sponge. And I can use both sides, and I do use both sides. And again, to clean them off, as I've said before, all you need to do is wipe them on a paper towel, a dry paper towel. As I'd said earlier, there is a nice tooth on this. Not as great as some charcoal and pastel papers, but just enough. Not as much as a true sanded paper. Okay, I'm going to be using ultramarine blue and the white and making just a little bit lighter. I'm blending the two of them, as you can see, and filling in blue areas of the sky. And the colorless blender that's already on the paper is helping to blend in those colors onto the paper as well. I'm working in a nice circular motion. Sometimes I go up and down and right to left, and sometimes I work in a circular motion. It's just what you feel like doing at the moment, or whatever you think or feels like is right for you at the moment. Okay, I'm darkening particular areas. There are parts of the sky that are going to be a little bit darker and parts of the sky that will be a little lighter because they're covered by partial fluffs of clouds. And now I'm beginning to lay in the clouds. I find it's surprisingly easy to create clouds using PanPastels. And generally, when you're working with pastels of any kind, in the soft pastels, you work dark and then light. In this case, I'm moving back and forth between both of them. I want to build up that blue and make it more consistent, but I also want to build up that white. And the white is very, very fine and very thick, and it covers very well. The more I blend away, the lighter, of course, that it gets, so it creates a sort of a shadow. And you know, when you look at the clouds, there is shadow beneath and shadow behind. But this, I'm using the oval edge blending stick. And I just tap and blend. I'm creating little clouds as I go and building those little clouds up more and more. As you can see at the top on the left, I've left it a little paler because there are clouds there and I want them to have a lighter appearance. As you can see, when I first apply the white, it's very, very bright. You see how quickly that the clouds are being built up? And I'm just tapping the color onto it and then at various points blending it in depending upon how light or dark I want it to be. The darker I want it to be, the more I blend it in so that it seems like the sky is coming through. And if you want to learn how to master a particular aspect of your art, the best thing to do is to do it and practice. Learn from your mistakes and learn from what you've done right and keep building on it. Every so often I approach an area. When I started doing birds, I did wings. And when I mastered the wings, I moved on to birds. I'd already been doing dogs and fur, and that was an issue, but birds were new to me. This was a few years ago. I want to create the greater shadow of the mountains. Here we go. That is the Pacific Ocean. These are mountains. California has a rocky shoreline. And I'm using a Paynes gray. But of course you can use any gray. You can mix black and white. You can add blue and purple and create any kind of color that you want with this. I'm just going for simple, simply because I'm just beginning to develop a handle on doing PanPastel landscapes and seascapes. So as important as it is to understand how to use your material, you also have to learn how to create particular objects. Everything just isn't the same. And I've always said that probably the best photographs you'll ever take will be photographs of mountains and rock formations. They're so interesting, and the cast of light and shadow and the colors that emerge are just magnificent, but they aren't necessarily as easy to paint or draw as they are to photograph. But it is interesting to do rocks and mountains because of the cast shadow, of the highlight, of the variations in color that exist within them. Mountains aren't just gray and they're not just brown. They have a variety of colors. Just double checking with my reference photo there. And now I'm just want to add a few more highlights to the mountain while it's back there and it's free, because that part of the mountain actually is going to be obscured by a large rock. And where I have my head right now, if you look behind it and you see how that seems like light coming through over the mountain, that's because I've allowed the whiteness of the cloud to hit the very edge of the mountain so that you've got the sense of light coming out from behind the mountains. It was a gray and overcast day, and the sky truly was cloudy and a little on the gray side. Now we're going to start bringing in some of the ocean. Now the Pacific Ocean is blue and the Atlantic Ocean is green. But some parts of the Atlantic Ocean are aqua. It depends upon the sea life and it depends upon what's beneath it. The Atlantic Ocean is blue in some areas. Outside of San Francisco, I'm not familiar with the rest of the state, but outside of San Francisco, it's a little bit purple. And that probably has a lot to do with our pollution of the waters in that area. And I'm using turquoise as well as ultramarine blue and ultramarine blue tint. It's really very easy to apply multiple colors and little streaks to build up the notion or the idea of a blue body of water. And of course, I could make it any color I wanted to because I'm the artist, but I'm going for naturalism here. And I'm mixing more of that turquoise shade and ultramarine blue. And in PanPastels, each color, each hue comes in 3 versions. There's the tint, the color, and the shade. The tint has white added to it, and the shade has black added to it. So this is something you can actually do. If you have just the solid colors, you can use the black and the white to create the shade version and the tint version. It just takes a little practice. Adding a little white and the blue to create the shoreline. The foam that comes off the ocean. And this is a shaded area, although it doesn't look like at the moment, where the water has washed onto the shore. I'm reaching back there for ochre yellow. Tint, excuse me. Rather than using a yellow like a Hansa or a Diarylide, I'm using the ochre because it will go better, well, it goes better with the beach, but also with the rock formations in the mountains. Ochre is a better blend with raw umber than is, say, Hansa yellow. And now I'm adding a little of that aqua and blue to bring more of that water up to the edge. When you're working with pastels, it's always best to start at the top and then come down. And that's simply because the powder from the pastel will come down. And then you can cover over it. It's all the other issue is if you start on the bottom to move up, you're going to get powder from the top coming down later, but you're also inadvertently going to smear the pastel with your hands and your fingers. At least this is something that I always do. Still working on that water edge. Adding a little bit of umber and blue. And as I said, you don't have to use the exact colors I'm using. What is important is creating light and dark to create contrast, to be able to set the picture so that there's a foreground, a middle ground, and a background when you're doing most landscapes or seascapes. You don't want it to look flat. You want it to feel as though you're going to step into the picture and be able to walk across the beach to the water or the beach to the mountains. I'm going to use the sponge applicator to bring in the raw umber tint. And because of the kind of color paper that I'm using, if any of that wheat shows through, it is perfectly all right. If I don't cover up a small portion or different spots completely, that wheat is going to blend in beautifully with the completed work. And I just picked up the the colorless blender and ran it over that because I wasn't blending very well. It wasn't running very smoothly. So then I'm going to start again with the Umber tint. And that looks much better, doesn't it? I'm using the very edge of this applicator to add in the darker area. And now I'm going to add in a darker area still on the beach where that has gotten wet. This is regular umber, raw umber. And I'm just adding the shadows of some rocks. Building them up from dark to light. And you may have noticed that when I'm using PanPastels, I don't actually draw. I am painting with my applicators, but I am not drawing. I'm not pulling out a pencil or a piece of chalk or laying out outlines. I really enjoy this. This is something I've just started doing since I started using PanPastels, and I really enjoy it. I find it very freeing to not do a drawing, and that's kind of strange coming from me because I love to draw. But I really like this painterly method of applying pastels. Instead of drawing, what I ultimately do is block out areas of light and dark and then blend in. And it's funny, it's something I learned when I was studying art at college a million years ago. And then somehow along the way forgot about. It's a little yellow ochre tint, excuse me. And as I said, the ochre blends and works so well with the raw umber. And I'm adding a colorless blender in this area. I hadn't added it before. I'm doing the giant rock formation here. Well, I don't know how giant it is, but you can certainly stand on it and walk all over it, as long as it's not wet and too slippery. And you'll make note as I work on this that I am covering up part of that mountain, the base of that mountain, while I create this rock formation. And that is very easily done using pastels. Now I'm applying more raw umber. A complaint that a lot of people have about using soft pastels is that it gets the pastels all over your fingers and they don't like the feeling of it. This doesn't bother me at all, but I have noticed that my fingers stay a little bit cleaner using the PanPastels because of the applicators and the sponges. Although I do occasionally go in and rub things in, blend with my fingers. I can't be trusted not to fall into those bad habits. And now I'm just using black to create some of the crevices within the rock. I'll put them in, I'll blend them into the umber. Just stippling it on and then blending it down, creating the ridges underneath the cracks. You look closely at this rock formation, you'll see that the umber is not applied smoothly, that there are dark areas and light areas, and that's perfect. That works to the building up of the 3 dimensions of the formation on paper. And you can use that as you apply your light and shadow. And of course, when you're applying the initial layer of whatever color you use, in this case it was the umber, you can look ahead and look at the reference photo and apply more to the areas that require more darkness, because you can always lighten them up with pastel. Now I'm using the Chromium Oxide green to add to that rock formation. There is a bit of plant life growing on it, not real plants, moss, excuse me, growing on it. And it very nicely works with the raw umber. It stands out just enough to make a difference, but it doesn't come out and glare at you as, say, permanent green would. You were using a permanent green, you'd want to darken it with some black before you applied it. You don't want it to be, you want it to appear very natural. You don't want it to be bright. And I'm just going to bring in the yellow ochre, the tint, excuse me, so that you can see me highlighting a little bit of that rock formation. just a gentle dabbing of the light onto the dark. I'm not really blending it in, I'm tapping it in. Now I'm adding white to the foam and to the little white streaks, light streaks to the ocean behind it so that you get a better appearance of waves. The paper size that I'm using is 9.5 by 12.5. It comes in metrics, and that's the conversion to inches. It's made in France, I believe, by Clairefontaine. I'm just adding little flecks of white so that you can see foam coming up, as you do when the waves, no matter how large or small they are, crash against the shoreline. Oh, I forgot to mention that the tape I'm using to hold down the piece of paper is washi tape. It's paper tape, and it will lift from most papers, but I always recommend that before you try holding anything down with any kind of tape, you should practice by laying the tape down and leaving it there for several hours. Come back, pick it up, see how it pulls away. And always the best way to take the tape off is to pull it down at an angle away from the piece, not toward the piece. But you can still tear the paper. You have to be so careful. And I'm using a Caran d'Ache white pastel pencil to just bring in a few lines of the water over the break and adding some more dots of white for the flying foam in the ocean. Stippling can be very tedious, but you also have to be very careful because you get so into it that you don't know when to stop. Just doing a little more fine detailing on the foam. Doing some final touch-ups. Adding a little bit more highlight and a little bit more dark here and there. And the beach is too smooth, so now I have to add a little bit more shadow. Just adding touches of the raw umber in little streaks to disturb the sand so that it doesn't look so smooth. And there are times when you want the sand to be very smooth, but this isn't one of them. If the sand is too smooth, it makes it stand out in a not good way from the rock formations and the water. Everything else has movements. By adding little streaks of the umber to the sand, you create movement within the sand that follows the movement in the stones and the mountains, the water, and the sky. And now I can sign my piece. I do thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed it and that you've learned a few things about pastels, PanPastels, and art in general. I've enjoyed sharing this piece, and I have to say I truly enjoyed painting or drawing, whatever we want to call pastel work, this particular landscape.